Somewhere in a laboratory in Vienna, a drill bit touches bone. The sample is small, a fragment from a skeleton excavated decades earlier beneath the ruins of an ancient tomb in Ephesus, on the coast of modern Turkey. The remains are believed to belong to a Ptolemaic princess, possibly Arsinoe IV, possibly the half-sister of the most famous woman who ever lived. The drill pulls a core of powder from the interior of the bone. It will be processed, sequenced, and compared against reference populations spanning North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The expectation is straightforward. The Ptolemaic dynasty was Macedonian Greek. 3 centuries of brother-sister marriages, uncle-niece pairings, and obsessive dynastic inbreeding had supposedly kept that bloodline sealed. The genetic profile should reflect that. It should look European, Hellenistic, Macedonian. It does not. The morphological analysis of the skull, conducted by Austrian archaeologist Hilke Thür and her team, suggests features inconsistent with a purely European ancestry. The skeletal indicators point toward mixed heritage, possibly North African, possibly maternal lineage from the African continent, not from Macedonia at all. And if that is true for even one member of the Ptolemaic royal family, then the most confident claim in classical history, that Cleopatra VII was Greek, case closed, no further questions, suddenly has a crack running through its center. Not a political argument about skin color, something harder to dismiss. A question about what was actually inside the bones of the dynasty that ruled Egypt for 300 years, and whether the story those bones tell matches the story the dynasty told about itself. To understand why this matters, you have to understand how airtight the old narrative seemed. The Ptolemaic dynasty began in 305 BCE, when Ptolemy I, a Macedonian general who had served under Alexander the Great, declared himself Pharaoh of Egypt. From that point forward, the family ruled as a Greek-speaking elite perched on top of one of the oldest civilizations on Earth. They built their capital at Alexandria. They spoke Greek. They minted coins with Hellenistic portraits. They positioned themselves explicitly as successors to Alexander, not as Egyptians. And they married each other. Relentlessly, brother married sister, uncle married niece. The pattern was so consistent that the Ptolemaic family tree is one of the most incestuous royal genealogies ever documented. The purpose was political. By keeping marriages inside the family, the Ptolemies maintained a claim to pure Macedonian blood, which in the Hellenistic world was the currency of legitimacy. For most of the 20th century, almost nobody saw a reason to question that. Ancient sources backed it up. Strabo, Plutarch, and Appian all described the intermarriage pattern. The coins showed Greek-style features. The court operated in Greek. The dynasty's own propaganda was absorbed directly into modern scholarship, and the conclusion seemed obvious: Greek blood in, Greek blood out, for 300 years straight. Cleopatra VII was the last of this line. Therefore, she was Greek. The textbook said so. The encyclopedias said so. Hollywood cast accordingly. Discussion over. But there was one detail that should have stopped the discussion from ever closing. Cleopatra VII's mother is never named, not in any surviving ancient source, not once. Her father is well documented, Ptolemy XII, called Auletes, the flute player, but the identity of her mother is a blank. For centuries, scholars assumed it was Cleopatra V Tryphena, another member of the royal family. That assumption was reasonable. It was also completely unverified. It entered biographies and reference works not as a hypothesis, but as a quiet default. Repeated so often, it hardened into something that looked like fact. But assumption is not evidence. And in genetics, the maternal line is everything. Mitochondrial DNA, the genetic material passed exclusively from mother to child, is the single most direct tracer of maternal ancestry. It does not recombine. It does not blend with the father's lineage. It passes intact, generation after generation, like a signature. And in the case of Cleopatra VII, that signature traces back to a woman whose name nobody recorded and whose ancestry nobody checked. For a long time, checking was not even possible. Egyptian mummy DNA is among the hardest ancient genetic material to recover. Egypt's climate is brutal on DNA. Heat accelerates degradation, and millennia of exposure to warm, fluctuating conditions fragment genetic material into pieces so small they were virtually unreadable with older technology. For decades, most published claims about ancient Egyptian DNA turned out to be contaminated or irreproducible. The field was burned badly by early controversies, including disputed results from Tutankhamun-era mummies that could not be reliably replicated. Serious paleogeneticists learned to stay away from Egyptian royal remains. The samples were too degraded, the politics were too charged, and the technology simply was not there. After 2010, next-generation sequencing transformed ancient DNA research. New methods could recover and reconstruct genetic information from fragments so small and so damaged that earlier techniques would have discarded them as noise. Suddenly, hot climate ancient DNA, the category that had defeated the field for years, became viable. And in 2017, the breakthrough arrived. A team published results in Nature Communications from mummies excavated at Abusir el-Melek, a site in Middle Egypt. The samples spanned over 1,000 years of Egyptian history, from the New Kingdom through the Ptolemaic and Roman periods. For the first time, the study demonstrated that reliable, reproducible ancient DNA could be extracted from Egyptian mummies. The door that had been locked for decades was now open. And what came through it did not match the old story. The Abusir el-Melek results showed that ancient Egyptians of the Ptolemaic and Roman periods carried significant genetic affinity with populations across North Africa and the Near East, with measurable Sub-Saharan African ancestry as well. The genetic landscape of Egypt under the Ptolemies was not European. The broader population surrounding the dynasty, the millions of people the Ptolemies ruled, taxed, administered, married into at lower social levels, and drew servants, concubines, and secondary wives from, was genetically North African and Near Eastern, with complex layers of admixture stretching back thousands of years. Now return to the Ephesus skeleton. The remains attributed to Arsinoe IV, Cleopatra's half-sister who shared a father but may have had a different mother, showed morphological features suggesting mixed ancestry on the maternal side. Not purely Macedonian, not purely Greek. The features pointed toward African heritage. And that is the crack in the wall. Not Cleopatra's own DNA. Not yet. But the physical evidence comes from someone sitting right next to her on the family tree. The central reveal is not complicated. It is this. The Ptolemaic dynasty was almost certainly not the sealed Macedonian Greek bubble that 2,000 years of scholarship assumed. The inbreeding was real, but it was not total. In nearly every generation there are unnamed mothers, unnamed consorts, women who entered the royal line and bore children and were never recorded. Wherever those names are missing, the old model simply assumed Greek ancestry. Nobody checked. For most of history, nobody could check. The dynasty's own political propaganda, "We are pure Macedonian, we are the heirs of Alexander," was absorbed directly into modern scholarship and treated as biological fact. It was not biological fact. It was a political claim. And the physical and genetic evidence now emerging suggests the reality was far more complicated. This is where the pattern starts to look less like an exception and more like a system. Consider the political logic. The Ptolemies needed Macedonian credentials to maintain legitimacy in the Hellenistic world. Admitting that royal mothers included Egyptian or North African women would have undermined that claim. So those women were not recorded. Their names were not preserved. Their ancestry was not acknowledged. The erasure was not accidental. It was structural. The dynasty had every reason to hide exactly the kind of admixture that the morphological and genetic evidence now suggests. And then there is Cleopatra herself. She was the first Ptolemaic ruler in 3 centuries known to speak Egyptian. She did not merely tolerate Egyptian culture, she actively embraced it. She presented herself as the living incarnation of Isis. She built temples in the Egyptian style. She participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies. For 2,000 years, historians have explained this as political calculation, a clever Greek queen playing to a local audience. But what if it was not entirely performance? What if her connection to Egypt was not just strategic, but ancestral? What if the Egyptian identity she cultivated reflected something the court had spent generations concealing? Here is what this rules out. It rules out the clean, closed-loop Macedonian family tree that appears in every standard reference. It rules out the confident claim that Cleopatra was unambiguously European. It does not prove she was African in any modern racial category. The genetics of the ancient Mediterranean do not map onto contemporary identity frameworks that cleanly. But it demolishes the certainty that she was not. The honest answer is that we do not know exactly what Cleopatra looked like, and the old confidence that we did was never based on evidence. It was based on silence, the silence of every maternal ancestor whose name was never written down. And this is not only about Cleopatra. It is about a pattern that keeps repeating wherever ancient DNA meets classical scholarship. Across the Mediterranean, population genetic studies are producing the same kind of surprise. Ancient Rome's genetic profile, revealed through large-scale studies of burials across the city and its provinces, turned out to be far more Eastern and North African than its imperial mythology ever acknowledged. Viking-era graves in Scandinavia have yielded individuals with Central Asian and Southern European ancestry. The genetic reality of the ancient world was messier, more mobile, and more mixed than the political narratives of the people who ran it ever admitted. Dynastic propaganda is not population genetics. It never was. The Ptolemies fit this emerging pattern perfectly. They were a ruling family that insisted on ethnic purity while governing one of the most genetically diverse populations in the ancient world for 300 years, with unnamed mothers in nearly every generation. The probability that no local ancestry entered the royal line across all those generations, all those unnamed women, all those unrecorded unions, is vanishingly small. Now the caveats. Because they matter, we do not have Cleopatra VII's own DNA, not yet. The identification of the Ephesus skeleton as Arsinoe IV is debated. Some scholars accept it, others remain skeptical. Morphological analysis alone cannot determine ancestry with the precision that full genomic sequencing would provide. And the Abuser El-Melek samples are commoners, not royals. The picture that emerges from all of this is strongly suggestive, not conclusive. It is a convergence of evidence: unnamed mothers, political incentive to conceal, morphological indicators, and regional population genetics. But it is not a closed case. What is conclusive is this: the old certainty was never earned. The claim that Cleopatra was Greek, purely Greek, definitively Greek, was never supported by the kind of evidence that would survive scrutiny in a modern genetics lab. It was supported by repetition, by assumption, and by the uncritical absorption of a dynasty's own self-serving narrative. If Egyptian authorities ever permit full genomic sequencing of the identified Ptolemaic royal mummies, and the technology to do it now exists, cleanly and reliably, the question could be answered directly. One sequencing run, one comparison against reference populations. The most famous woman in ancient history might be a single laboratory session away from a confirmed identity, or she might stay in the gap forever. Unresolved, unsequenced, suspended between a political mythology that claimed her and a biological truth that was never allowed to speak. But think about the women who made this question possible. Not Cleopatra, the others, the unnamed ones. Generation after generation of women who entered the Ptolemaic court, bore royal children, and vanished from the record. Their names are gone, their faces are gone, their stories were never considered worth preserving, but their mitochondrial DNA, the one thing that passes only through the maternal line, untouched by the father, unchanged by the dynasty's political machinery, may still survive. In tooth enamel, in the dense interior of bone, in the mummies that have sat inside museum cases for over a century, while thousands of visitors walked past them every year, reading labels that told one story while the genome inside waited to tell another. History did not lose Cleopatra's identity by accident. It overwrote it, with confidence, with repetition, with the systematic erasure of every mother whose name no one thought important enough to record. The coins survived, the propaganda survived, the assumption survived, but so did the bones. And the bones remember what the records chose to forget.